Keyword up here, and that's preliminary. These results haven't been reviewed by anyone. They are our results as students, and so they do have to be taken with probably more than a few grains of salt. That said, you can see right here what we have is visualization of all of the impact categories from all of the different buildings and structures that we analyzed. They've been normalized to the largest value. So in any one given impact category, the building that had the largest impact in that category was basically the foundation for the ratio of everything else. For instance, in global warming, the CIRS building had the highest global warming impact. And so as a result, everything else was done relative to that. This doesn't do us a lot of good because you're kind of comparing apples to oranges in this situation. You're looking at buildings that are going to be used for transportation in one case, and buildings that are going to be used for academic purposes in another. And to judge them on that same on a similar function unit is pretty much impossible. And so what we've done is group them into more comparable units. So in this case, we've got the residential buildings, and we can see here the way different residential buildings have come out in terms of their performance environmentally. Certain ones are really setting the bar in terms of what a high impacting building is going to be. So that would be the B residence, which pretty much across the board was one of the larger impacting ones, whereas the WE residence had a much smaller impact overall. But this lets us compare the same functional units. We're looking at residence structures in this case, and so they all have the same approximate use of their floor space. In another instance, we've got our academic buildings on campus. Now this presents another issue where we're comparing a bit of apples to oranges here, because some buildings are going to have more office space, some buildings are going to have learning space, some are going to be more lab space. And so there is a bit of a discrepancy there in terms of what the actual functional units are for each building. But again, if we just step back and look at it as the overall impacts of the building, it allows us to compare the impacts and see which buildings are performing how well in their construction and use and demolition. Finally, and this is again another issue we had with functional units. This is the viaduct. We compared the use of it at its end of life as a greenway, and then its end of life just being cut down and hauled away. Now it's going to be a little bit surprising, and maybe one of those cases where we are hanging green washing out to dry, where turning it into a greenway has a disproportionately larger impact relative to the cut and haul. It just looks a lot bigger. And a lot of that does have to do with the fact that the functional units for the viaduct, they're not the same for both of these. In one case, we're ignoring what's being left behind, which is just essentially empty tracts of land. For the cut and haul, we're just getting stuff off site. There's no consideration of what's happening after the fact. With greenway, we are adding that functional use back into the area and giving it and using it as green space. And so, in order to take this to the next step, it would probably be advisable to take cut and haul and say, well, let's imagine this if we just took it out and then turned it into a park that took up the same amount of space. That would probably be a more equal comparison. So I'm going to talk a bit about sensitivity analysis. And this is where a lot of the other projects, this was what the goal was for them. So the way sensitivity analysis is done is we look at typically the top 5, but in our case we were looking at really the predominant impacting material. In a lot of cases this is going to be concrete. And we're going to increase that material's use by 10% and decrease that material's use by 10%. And that allows us to compare how any variation in our construction techniques, especially if we're looking at this from the design space, how any variation in our construction technique could have an impact on the impacts of the building. So it gives us the opportunity to compare how we could move on in the future. And a great example of this are the glazing, the analysis of buildings glazing. So what was found, the way they did it was they took the envelope area and changed the glazing ratio on the outside from 40, 50, and 60%. And so at each of these steps, there was an increase or a decrease in the amount of impacts in each stage of the life cycle. So initially, construction impacts are reduced as it increases. And the deconstruction is reduced as well. A lot of that has to do with the transportation cost, because glass is a lot lighter and doesn't cause as many long-term impacts as concrete does in its production, as that's likely what you're replacing it with. But during the use phase, the impacts went up significantly, especially in use and maintenance. There's an issue here with the fact that Athena assumes that you're doing a 5 or 6, I think it's 5 to 6 maintenance cycles per over the lifetime of the building. And so that's been an issue because you probably aren't replacing your windows every 10 years. You're likely only replacing them as need be. Now, you are maintaining windows a lot more than you would concrete. And so this kind of gives you that perspective of how much varying one piece in your building can impact the overall impact of the building. So, like I said, our results are only preliminary. These have to be reviewed, and we have to have a little bit of oversight to make sure that what we're doing is right. The sensitivity analysis should be continued all the way through most of the other impacting materials in buildings, so that we can get an even better perspective of how adjusting our construction techniques will affect it. And there's just more support that can be done towards everything. So what is the future of LCA? And Ahmed's going to come up and talk about that. Thank you.
All right, so you guys just heard what LCA is, how we incorporated LCA to figure out the impacts of our buildings and basically our results. So what is next? All right, so through the development of our projects, we're contributing towards creating awareness among stakeholders, not only within UBC, but around the world. Our reports basically are going to be put on online databases and distributed amongst different companies that help develop these databases to help I don't know, increase the efficiency, I guess, or reduce the uncertainty involved within developing these LCAs. We're also contributing towards educational assets. As we said earlier, the SEEDS program is taking all our reports and putting them onto an online database. We're going to talk about these things more in a sec. We're also promoting the use of LCA and other assessment tools. This is sort of what this presentation is. We're promoting the use of LCA. And increase the responsibility in environmental accounting. Now that you know there is a program, at least once we sort of promote the use of LCA, the fact that you know there is LCA and there's a way of quantifying the total impacts of these materials, you really have no excuse in not trying to reduce the impacts, I guess, or using these programs. All right, so for those of you who don't know what SEEDS is, SEEDS is a UBC program. It's part of the Sustainability Office in UBC. SEEDS stands for Social, Ecological, Economic Development Studies. Basically what it does, it unites all these studies around UBC and other operations to help sort of push UBC's commitment towards the sustainability and enhance its reputation as a sustainable leader around the world. So what SEEDS is doing is they're taking all our reports and they're sort of putting them onto an online database. This online database is available to anyone, not only to UBC students, but anyone around the world. The objective of this is to help future LCA studies sort of give them like a template, I guess, or the fact that like if you have something to work against or you've seen what people have done before you, it's sort of easier to build upon it and make it better. That's sort of what the initiative is here. And policy making, something that actually our projects were directly related to was UBC policy making, more specifically the residential environmental assessment program, which is basically their, how can I say this? All right, so earlier you guys heard about sensitivity analysis. What we did is we evaluated the sensitivity of increasing and decreasing the glazing ratio of residential buildings around UBC. The objective was to see how the total impacts would change if we increased or decreased the glazing ratio. UBC policymakers are taking those figures to sort of enforce new policies for new developments around UBC to sort of increase the sustainability. For those of you, I guess we've already spoken about Athena before. Athena is the software makers. They're a non-profit organization. They work with different sustainability leaders around the world in product manufacturing, building design, construction, and green labeling, sort of limit the footprint of